Your Honor? Gank fights. Everybody loves gank fights. Tough to defeat, but even tougher to design in a way that is fair. Like pairing an enemy that is thin and fast and has a ranged attack with an enemy that is fat and slow and doesn't have a ranged attack. A duality that could only be rivaled by pairing an enemy that is thin and fast and has a ranged attack with an enemy that is fat and fast and has a ranged attack. But today we are not talking about Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 4. Today we are talking about Lies of P Overture, that added another boss to the pantheon of gank fights. A boss that I actually enjoy quite a bit. Markiona, the Puppeteer of Death, does certain things with the concept of a gank fight that I really like and consider worthy of discussion. Especially after seeing some people miss those things and thus misunderstand how the boss fight really works. Now, despite me liking this fight, I'll be the first one to tell you that it is not flawless. There are definitely potential improvements to be made, and she also deviates from the baseline game mechanics in some ways. So, before we get to the good stuff, in classic fashion of this channel, I will elaborate on those deviations and try to figure out whether they count as flaws. First deviation is the most obvious. When dealing damage to pretty much every enemy that I can think of, a part of their health bar will become semi-transparent, rather than a normal red. This section of their health will slowly regenerate if you don't apply further damage to that enemy. But Queen's Archpuppet does not have this recoverable health. Supposedly, the idea behind it was that the puppet could be out of your reach for extended periods of time, while Markiona is attacking. So it would have regenerated quite a lot of health otherwise. However, this does work in tandem with a second deviation, which is the fact that this puppet cannot be staggered, no matter how much you pair its attacks. Making the puppet non-staggerable is a strange choice, but it's only unique among bosses and elites. Many basic enemies are not staggerable either, which is compensated by their low health. And to be fair, Queen's Archpuppet is not particularly tanky for a boss class enemy. So these first two deviations kind of compensate each other, since normally the way you get rid of the recoverable health is with a fatal attack, which you cannot perform here because the puppet is non-staggerable. The only real drawback is that it reduces the reason to risk trying to parry the puppet. Though it's not entirely pointless, which I will get to later. Third deviation is the fact that if Markiona begins her phase 2 opening attack when she is in a stagger-ready state, that state will be cleared and your stagger progress will be lost. Now, I would be lying if I said that I am a huge fan of this behavior, but this is actually not that much of a deviation. It is a pattern, with bosses that have two phases on the same health bar with no cutscene. A consistent pattern established by the first 3 bosses of the game. And also, to be honest, a cutscene phase transition would also result in a loss of stagger progress. On top of that, the game doesn't exactly hide the fact that your stagger progress is gone, because it clearly removes the white border indicator from the boss's health bar. Unlike a certain elephant mini-boss that can tank a charge attack in a stagger-ready state just because of the phase transition, even though the health bar is still flashing white. Number 4. Blocking or guarding in this game is not omnidirectional like in Neo, for example, and enemies attacking you from behind are very much a threat. And yet, attacks from Queen's Archpuppet can be blocked even with your back turned to it, even if you're not locked onto Markiona. This one most likely has the highest impact on gameplay, making the fight much easier than it would have been otherwise. The end result is that the player gains more options to deal with the puppet's attacks, without swinging the camera around. But in my opinion, this rule break should not have been implemented, because it reduces the pressure put on the player from needing to pay attention to the puppet's location. And personally, when I fight Markiona, I sort of just pretend that it's not a thing, and instead simply dodge or strafe the puppet's attacks. And finally, camera behavior during certain attacks. Here, for example, if you try to lock onto the puppet, the camera will look at Markiona anyway. Likewise, during this flight combo, regardless of who you are locked onto, the camera will follow the puppet during the flight part, and then pivot to Markiona when she prepares to drop a sphere from above. A questionable design decision on its surface, so let's question it. It doesn't actually wrangle camera control from you when you're unlocked. which in my opinion would have been bad. It doesn't forcibly switch the lock on target either. It will still be very disorienting before you finally get used to it, but the silver lining is that it does help you to see the incoming attacks. Which is kind of important in case of this combo, because the finisher is the only Fury attack that Markiona has. As a reminder, Fury attacks cannot be iframed through or blocked, only perfect guarded. Or just strafed or outspaced, which is quite easy to do in this case. And this brings us to a running theme with this boss fight, which is that besides the phase 2 opener, the scariest looking attacks that Markiona has tend to also be the easiest to just walk away from, which is a completely valid tactic, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You could stand and parry all of this, but why bother? Why risk it? The answer is stagger damage. You risk it for stagger damage. But the point is that you don't have to. This is entirely your choice, specifically because the alternative is just that easy. And this is why I like this fight so much, because of how many of this fight's aspects can be influenced by player choice. It is entirely up to you whether you want to ignore the puppet and just focus on Markiona. You can also alternate between attacking one or the other, depending on presented opportunity. Or you can create the opportunity yourself, position yourself in such a way that you will be able to hit both at the same time. And nothing exemplifies that philosophy better than being able to interrupt the phase 2 opening attack by destroying the puppet. In fact, destroying the puppet will interrupt absolutely any attack or action. So, now that the puppet is gone, what is your reward? Well, first of all, it immediately deals a bit of damage to Markiona, but it also puts her through 2 non-attack animations, giving you time to deal even more free damage. The revive animation is separate from the initial stun, so if you land a stagger on her before she starts healing the puppet, you will further delay the puppet coming back online. Whether that is something you want, once again, depends on your choice. Without a puppet, Markiona will obviously have a limited and thus less threatening moveset, but perhaps you prefer the punish windows that her puppet-related attacks offer. So you would rather wait for the puppet to come back. Well, good news, because so would Markiona. If you disengage after breaking the puppet, she will sometimes do one attack, but will not chase you further, and even more, she will explicitly dash to her puppet and stay there, passive, until the puppet is up. Unless you choose to fight. While it is unusual to see a boss completely passive, when it comes to gank fights, conditional partial passivity is a very important topic. Generally, there are 2 main things that can damage the feeling of a gank fight. The first is frame traps, caused by overlapping attacks. The important thing to note here is that this is not an inherently bad thing. The possibility of a frame trap itself should incentivize you to adjust your positioning to minimize that possibility. So the real deciding factor in how fair overlapping attacks are is the clarity of those attacks, meaning telegraphing and camera control. Second issue, however, sometimes arises when developers try to avoid having to deal with overlapping attacks by adjusting how passive the gankers are. To varying degrees of success, which mostly comes down to the justification for that passivity. Make them too passive for no reason, and you've essentially traded one issue for another. To give you an example of this being done relatively well, let's look at the first encounter with Black Rabbit Brotherhood, where the additional gankers will spawn when the main boss, Eldest Rabbit, loses enough health. And while they are present on the arena, Big Chungus will be very passive and essentially only charge at you with a war cry that clearly telegraphs, even from off-screen, that he is coming. That passivity can be very easily explained by him recovering from the damage you just dealt to him. The second encounter, however, makes only one of the 3 gankers active, while the other 2 will just slow walk until their turn comes. With no real reason either, they just wait. Except they will still occasionally throw projectiles at you, which can and will frame trap you. So the overlapping attacks issue isn't even solved, and the fight ends up being incredibly frustrating because of this. Even though the overall difficulty of the fight is quite low, And both of those aforementioned issues Markiona solves in quite an elegant manner. The attacks are not going to overlap because they are executed in a sequence that is controlled by Markiona. Off-screen attacks by the puppet are not an issue because every time the puppet is commanded to attack, the string will glow red, which gives you plenty of time to react. And as for the reasoning for passivity, the puppet will become passive because it is not being actively controlled at the moment, and Markiona will be passive because she actually isn't, since she is busy controlling the puppet. On the surface, it is still a gank fight, but it is synchronized to such a degree that there is a decently popular sentiment among Markiona fans that it doesn't really count as a proper duo fight. Something closer to 1.5, and that you can treat Queen's Archpuppet as a glorified weapon with a health bar. Which is where I need to mention the weapon break mechanic. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that parrying the puppet isn't all that useful because it's not staggerable. And that is true, but that's not the whole truth, because the weapon break mechanic still applies to it. And although there are unfortunately no visible changes to the model, triggering the weapon break will stun Markiona in the same way as destroying the puppet will. That same stun animation will be applied if you parry the puppet during the attacks, where Markiona will project the golden aura buff. Namely, the overhead slam that the puppet does during this combo, the long delayed overhead slam, and the second type of the puppet flight combo. There is also nothing stopping you from chaining this stun into another stun if you destroy the puppet right after. On top of that, parrying the puppet being thrown at you during the phase transition will completely remove the explosions for the first 2 strikes and dramatically reduce the explosion radius for the final one, which opens up punish windows for you to deal damage to Markiona or to the puppet if your goal is to destroy it to cancel the final explosion. So, to summarize, is this a perfect fight? No, not at all. The rule breaks I went over at the start of the video, as usual, I consider to be unnecessary. And there is also this attack, which is complete nonsense from an animation perspective. Because that first upward leg swing is not an attack. It doesn't have a hitbox yet, that's just the wind-up, which is not intuitive in the slightest. However, that attack aside, the overall animation quality in this fight I would consider to be quite high for this game. But like I said at the start, the main reason I made this video is because of people who get frustrated because they treat this fight as a typical gank fight, which it honestly isn't. To bring out the comparison to Dark Souls 3 for a moment, the dynamic of this fight is much closer to something like Lothric and Lorien, rather than a more classic gank like Demon in Pain and Demon from Below. And once that realization sets in, once you start seeing all the windows of opportunity opening specifically because of that dynamic, I believe you will be able to enjoy this fight much more than if you approach it as nothing more than a regular duo fight. And that's about all I've got for you for today. If you've enjoyed this video, do those things that YouTubers tell you to do in situations like this. But also there is a Discord server, where you might see some behind the scenes stuff and maybe even teach me something. And I'll see you all at some indeterminate point in the future.